Hey guys, welcome to another movie review. Today I'm going to be talking about a film that came out in the early 2000s that starred Jim Carrey. It was called The Majestic. So I'm reviewing this film right here for you today. Um, the Majestic was a film that came out in the early 2000s. I very vaguely remember it coming out. It did strangely enough come out about 2 years before one of my favorite Jim Carrey films, which was Bruce Almighty, which I absolutely love to this day. One of my all-time favorite movies. One of my favorite Jim Carreys easily. But in The Majestic, this came out around the time too in Jim Carrey's career where he was trying out more dramatic roles. He was doing more films like Simon Birch, this movie, The Majestic. He did that The Number 23, which was definitely a more dramatic, darker role for him. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So Jim Carrey at this point of his career was doing more like dramatic kind of stuff. Still stuff that kind of favored his comedic talent for sure. But definitely, you could definitely tell at that point in his career he was trying to do more dramatically based kind of things, which he'll still do every once in a while, but he's definitely going more so back to the comedy route recently with Sonic the Hedgehog and things like that. But in the film The Majestic, this film's, believe it or not, directed by Frank Darabont, who worked on films I've absolutely loved over the years. Like he's done The Shawshank Redemption, he's directed The Green Mile, he wrote the screenplay for Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, which I absolutely love, and that was kind of his entryway into Hollywood to begin with. So he's worked on some films that I've really, really liked. He's even co-wrote that 2014 Godzilla film that I really liked as well. So Frank Darabont's definitely somebody that's made a lot of stuff that I've really liked. So I went into this film with a lot of hope because I love Jim Carrey, I love Frank Darabont, and for the most part, The Majestic has an interesting concept to it, which I'm about to explain for you guys too if you've never heard of this movie. But in The Majestic, this film is about a Hollywood screenwriter who gets blacklisted. It's during the Red Scare where people are being framed for communism. If anybody thinks whatsoever at all that somebody's involved with communism, and if they're involved in the Hollywood system at all, obviously they're in bigger trouble because they get a lot of heat all the time, a lot of press with their film projects and things like that. So, unfortunately for Jim Carrey's screenwriter, he is a part of this blacklist. People think he is a communist. He attended this meeting that clearly had communists attending the meeting and things like that. So he goes on the run. He goes for a drive, and he gets into a car accident, which ultimately leads him into a river. He gets knocked unconscious, and he wakes up into a small town that people think he's actually somebody else. They think he's this person that's been gone for over 9 years, and they think it's the son of this man that owns this movie theater in the town called the Majestic. And so Martin Landau plays this father of this character, and he truly believes that Jim Carrey's character is his son. He thinks that, because he was off at war, because this film takes place around like 1951, so roughly around the time where World War II was kind of coming to a close and things like that. So he really does believe that this man is his son. So the town kind of celebrates this. They welcome him back. They try to embrace some things about what they remember about this guy that he had when he was alive. He was good at playing the piano. He was the son of this movie theater owner that everybody went to for the movies in this town. So there's a lot of things about this guy that people are really hoping that they have found him over all these years. And because Jim Carrey lost his memory when waking up on this beach after this accident, he kind of has to go with this because he doesn't really remember who he is. And so over the course of the film, because the Red Scare is still going on and there's still everybody's kind of on a witch hunt for the people who might be communists, somebody does find out that he is living in this town, and they think that he's trying to go under this pseudonym, under this person that everybody thinks that he is, where clearly he was still the screenwriter after all this time. So throughout the course of this film, he has to figure out, is he really the son of this guy? Does he kind of have to just kind of take everything with a grain of salt? Is he really this screenwriter that got in that accident and now has to go to court again for the communist thing? So over the course of this film, this man has to figure himself out over the course of The Majestic. But overall, guys, unfortunately, Majestic didn't really work for me overall. There's things about it that I really admire. There's things about it that I really like. There's things about it where I still admire Frank Darabont's directing abilities and Jim Carrey's acting abilities and his more desire to work in more dramatic films like this film. At the end of the day, though, The Majestic unfortunately doesn't work. There's things about it that I'm going to explain later in my negatives that really don't really make this film work very well. And don't get me wrong, there's things I like about this film. There's good things in this movie. There's things that definitely show how good of a director Frank Darabont is if you hand him the right project. Unfortunately, there's also things about this film where I can see why Frank Darabont never really went for a film like this ever again as far as directing goes, and why he went for more films like The Mist and Godzilla and more serious toned films. And I think he directed episodes of The Walking Dead, I believe, too. So more serious toned projects that weren't on the line of a dramedy or comedy slash drama that The Majestic was. So let's go over some positives and negatives of Majestic, and unfortunately why it doesn't really work for me overall as a film. But for my positives of the Majestic, for things that I like about the film and things that make a film that isn't a terrible experience, but certainly not an amazing one either. Um, I think for the most part, The Majestic is a great love letter to classic cinema. It is a film that does celebrate films of the 50s, films of the 60s, Wizard of Oz, Citizen Kane, the works of Charlie Chaplin, the work of silent films. It really does, it's a love letter to all those things. And there's even scenes in this movie where Martin Landau is trying to explain to Jim Carrey that these films really do belong to be seen on a big screen. Seeing it on a television at home just kind of ruins it. Seeing it in a small box is just not the same experience as seeing it on a big screen. It's just so great to be with an audience and experience the laughs with each other, experience the emotions with each other. And unfortunately, that's the only way you can really get that experience with a movie is if you see it on a big screen with an audience. And so there's things like that in the film that really are a love letter to classic cinema that I 100% agree, and I 100% kind of where Frank Darabont is coming from regarding classic cinema and why it belongs on a big screen. The film also does depict very well the tragedy of the Hollywood Blacklist, how if you attend a meeting, if you are friends with somebody, or if you are associated with a communist whatsoever, you would be placed on the list. You would have to go to the courtroom. You would have to plead guilty. And just how tragic it was, and just how it ruined so many lives, and how the screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, I think his name was, how he really kind of had to go under a different name for the rest of his career just because nobody wanted to see his name on a movie, whether it was writing it or producing it or directing it. And the film really does depict how when you were on that list, you kind of had to run. You really could not be in the job that you were in and have that kind of thing on your shoulder while everybody was looking for you during this witch hunt. So it really was a tragedy of being on that list and really kind of going to court and proving that you weren't a communist and things like that. And so even something as small as attending a meeting that had a communist in it, like what Jim Carrey's character had to go through, was just enough to put you on the list. And it really showed just how tragic of a thing it was if you were placed on that list. I really like Martin Landau's role in this movie too. Really lovable guy. You could really tell loves classic cinema and really wanted this theater up and going again in this town since it was a really important part of that town. So you really like his character. You really want him to really believe that this character that Jim Carrey washed ashore onto the beach for this town was his son. And there's even scenes here where Jim Carrey has a hard time explaining to him that he might not be his son. And so there's a lot of scenes here where you really just love the guy, and like what Carrey's character faces in this movie, they're on the scenes where he has to kind of sit down and talk to him and be like, "Hey, I might not be your son." It really does depict very well just how hard of a conversation that is for him when he has to kind of do that kind of stuff. I also really like the lighting in this film, whether it's in the town or in Hollywood or a character attending a movie premiere. They really did a great job lighting the film, and I thought that was really well done over the entire course of the 2.5 hours that this film is, which we are going to bring up later on in this review. There's also a lot of likable characters in this town. I believe the man that played one of the prisoners in Shawshank Redemption had a role in this movie. He also plays an older guy in this movie again. Just really likable people. You can really tell they kind of have their own little role in the town, and that they really kind of had their own little connection with this person that was off to war that they think Jim Carrey is. So a lot of likable characters in this town that keep the film fun whenever they show up in the movie. And overall, this is an interesting concept. I can see why Frank Darabont wanted to make this movie. It really is an interesting concept about the Hollywood Blacklist and about rediscovering yourself and all that kind of stuff. So there's things here that work, and there's certain things that are interesting about it. But now we have to go over into the negatives of what doesn't work about the Majestic overall. So for the Majestic, for my negatives, this film is way too long. It's 2.5 hours long, and I really, to this day, cannot name a single comedy, drama, or dramedy that needs to be that long. I think this film really would have benefited from a better editor, make it 45 minutes shorter, really trim down what the Majestic's about, really focus in on the Hollywood Blacklist, and focus in on what this town really had to offer for this guy as far as rediscovering himself goes. I think if the film really focused in on that and really took its time on those two specific things, this film would have worked much better. But unfortunately, it is 2.5 hours. It spends a lot of time on things that it really doesn't need to be in the movie. There's dances and parties and things going on in this small town that really did not need to be in the film at the end of the day. I think a solid 45 minutes of trim out for this movie as far as the editing room was concerned really would have benefited this movie. And like I said, the film really tries to balance two stories at once, and they're very different stories. And I think that's why the film ultimately doesn't work, because if you're doing one story about a blacklist writer on the run, and you're doing another story about a guy washing up to shore with amnesia and trying to figure out if he's this guy everybody's claiming him to be, those are kind of two different things. Yeah, you can combine them. Yeah, you can make a hybrid story out of those two concepts, but at the end of the day, are you doing one of those stories? Or are you doing the other story? And if you're trying to do both, how are you going to do both? And I think the film never bothers to connect those. It just chooses to do both at once, be a really long 2.5 hour movie, and it just can't balance the two very well. I also never understood why Jim Carrey specifically was in the lead role here. I love his work. I love Jim Carrey. I understand his desire to have more dramatic projects come his way. Nothing about this performance or the character really struck me as Jim Carrey necessarily. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how Frank Darabont chose Jim Carrey or why Jim Carrey himself chose this role. For me personally, nothing really Jim Carrey-ish about it came to mind while watching this movie, and it's only PG, so it's not like you could do a lot of really out there stuff with Jim Carrey either. So I don't really understand why it's Jim Carrey specifically in this lead role, other than he's just a really good actor who can do really good comedic things in your movie. So I never really understood why he was the specific choice for the lead role in this. A lot of time is also spent in this small town. So if you like the Hollywood Blacklist stuff and it's interesting to you, and you love the whole classic cinema love letter thing, the film unfortunately doesn't spend a lot of time with that. It spends a lot of time with him getting to know the people in this town and him trying to figure out if he's this guy and everything. And unfortunately, I think that hurts the movie. It's just the least interesting part of the movie, and unfortunately, the film spends a ton of time on that one concept. It's also a very slow-moving movie. It's very, very slow. I actually got kind of sleepy-eyed watching this movie at certain times just because it's very slow-moving. It takes its very sweet, slow time getting from one point to another. It's very, very slow. Definitely wish they could have had better pacing with this movie. I also thought more time in LA really needed to happen here. Besides the beginning and the end of this movie, that's really all the time they spend in LA and him being a screenwriter and things like that. And it's kind of one of the better parts of the movie, too, like I was saying earlier. So more time in LA, I thought, would have really helped this movie quite a bit, especially like 1950s LA, where it was like the golden age of Hollywood. I think that definitely would have helped this movie, because when they're there, it's really interesting. But overall, I'm going to give The Majestic a 6.5 out of 10. I think there's interesting things about this movie. There's things about it that are intriguing and interesting, but at the end of the day, it's just way too long for its own good. It can't balance two stories at once. It just can't do it. I really need the more specification here why Jim Carrey is the lead role here. It doesn't really strike me very much as a Jim Carrey movie necessarily. A lot of time is spent in that small town, and like I said, I think this film would have benefited with a more Hollywood Blacklist focus on the movie. Very slow moving, and more time in LA was really needed to make this film work. So 6.5 out of 10. If you see The Majestic, go into it knowing that it's not Frank Darabont or Jim Carrey's best performances or best work. There's interesting things about it, but at the end of the day, there's just a ton of problems with this movie, so it's kind of hard to recommend for me, unfortunately.